appreciate eccentric people. Okay, so we're going to start, and everybody else will come in as they come in with your permission. So thank you all for joining us today on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience. We are quite excited to have here Alan Niku once again for the second in the two-part series, and we hope to have many more, as there's really quite a bit out there that we need to learn from him just based on what we started with last week. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you all who are in the audience, and thank you to those who are seeing this in recorded because you didn't make it on time today. So just a brief overview. Alan is a filmmaker, writer, and scholar of Mizrahi culture from San Luis Obispo, which we just mentioned, and now he's based in Los Angeles. He is a native speaker of Persian, and as we said last time, speaks many more languages than that and is learning constantly. New languages all the time. He's also a musician and an amateur chef, and teaches history and Jewish heritage at various levels and seeks to educate the world about the underrepresented cultures of the Middle East through writings, films, and lectures. So as our goals align, we are so happy to have you join us today. Thank you, and thank you to all in the audience. Please do, if you have questions, throw them into the Q&A. I will be monitoring the Q&A and chat throughout, so Alan, you don't have to worry about that. If there's something that's urgent, I will interrupt. Otherwise, we will go straight with the presentation, and then everybody get yourselves ready, because I do encourage you to open your cameras after the formal presentation to ask questions, but also throw them into the chat or Q&A throughout. And I know you did not come to hear me. So Alan, over to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Dora. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So, hopefully those who weren't here last week have either watched the video or are ready to just jump in. So last week we talked a little bit about key figures of Persian Jewry, Persian, Iranian, using the terms interchangeably. We talked about people from the Arab era through the Mongol era, so around 600 through the 1300s. Today we're going to do the Safavid, or just before the Safavid era in the 1400s, through to the modern era, or at least until the kind of late 1800s, because the last 100 years or so have a lot more people that we know about, and so that would be kind of, that could be a whole couple hours of its own. So there's going to be the kind of post-medieval era today. So just a reminder, last week, some of the people we talked about Mashallah ibn Atari, who is an astronomer and astrologer. We talked about a bunch of revolutionaries and heretics who were very influential in medieval Judaism, who came out of Iran. We talked about some rabbis, both Rabbinite and Karaite rabbis. We talked about some powerful Jews, some of the viziers of the Mongols, which was kind of the end of Jewish power in Persia. And we ended up with talking about Shahin Shirazi, who is a mystical poet of the Persian Jews who wrote epic poems based on the Torah. So this week we're going to do a lot less on warriors. There aren't as many kind of warrior characters in this era of Persian Jewry. There are a lot more poets and writers, and we have actually a lot more primary sources. So hopefully you'll enjoy hearing about poets and actually reading some of their works, because that's what we have today. So we'll start with Emrani. Emrani is a major character in Persian Jewish history. He is sort of the second most important poet we have after Shahin. So a lot of people know about Shahin, who was from Shiraz, and he wrote epic poems based on the books of Shemot and Bereshit, and just the whole Torah, and then a little bit on the stories of Esther and Ezra. So Emrani lived about 100 years after Shahin. Emrani was born in the very important Jewish city of Esfahan. Esfahan's right there in central Iran. You can see that on the map. And in Esfahan, he set out to complete Shahin's work. So Shahin had done the Torah and a little bit of the rest of the Tanakh. And a couple other writers at this point had come and done like the book of Daniel and a couple more books. Emrani wanted to do the whole thing. He wanted to finish doing the whole Tanakh as versified Persian, Judeo-Persian epic poems. So at the age of 20, he wrote Fatnameh, which is the book of conquest. And it covers the books of Joshua, Ruth, and Samuel. And since Daniel had already been done and Judges had already been done at this point, this basically covered all of the story of Moses all the way through David and Solomon. And he wrote it in the same way as Shaheen, in these epic poems that you can actually read, and it all rhymes and it has rhythm and it's well-written literature, and it's just based on these books of the Tanakh. And he was very popular. He had a lot of support. He had patrons like someone named Amin al-Dawla, which is somebody in the government. We're not sure exactly who that was, but it seems like it was a non-Jewish person in the government who supported Emrani's writing, and also support from rabbis like Rabbi Yehuda. And despite that, he never completed this huge book. And it's a huge book. I mean, I recently, when I was in Israel, I saw a handwritten version of it that somebody had in a private collection and is trying to get into a museum. And it's a massive, massive book with many, many pages of handwritten stuff that this guy got from Kashan, like from his grandfather who got it from his grandfather who got it, passed down through generations. So in 1480, Emrani was forced to leave Esfahan. We're not sure exactly what the nature of the conflict was, but he had a conflict with the Jewish community and he had to leave the city. And so he moved to the nearby city of Kashan. Kashan at this time, very flourishing city, big Jewish population, big textile industry. It was getting very important. And you'll see that because many of the people we're going to talk about today were from Kashan. So Emrani moved from Esfahan to Kashan. And in Kashan, he continued to write and just kept writing more and more works. His language is a lot more indebted to Hebrew. It has a lot more Hebrew in it than Shaheen. Shaheen was very classical Persian in its language. Emrani has more Hebrew in there in the Persian. It's still overwhelmingly Persian. And it also has a lot more stuff from rabbinical Judaism in it. And it also has themes of alienation and disillusionment that likely is from his exile from his hometown, and he had to move to Kashan. This picture, by the way, is not Kashan, it's Esfahan. So a little bit later in his life, Emrani started to write. He wrote, as we can see, like these rabbinical writings. He wrote a book of the 13 commandments and pillars of the Jewish faith, based on the 13 principles of faith by Maimonides. So he's taking now not just things from the Tanakh, but things from rabbinical writings from the 1100s and turning them into Jewish epic poem versifications, which is quite unique at this time. Suggests that the Persian Jews of the time had a strong interest in Jewish law and philosophy. He also then went on to do Hanukkah Nameh, which is the book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha. It's not even in the Tanakh. It's just other writings. It's the story of the Maccabees and Hanukkah and all of that. And he wrote that as a Persian epic poem. He then wrote his masterpiece in 1536, is that he's getting quite old at this point. And this is called Ganj Nameh, so it's a versification of Pirkei Avot. So now not only rabbinical writings, not only the Tanakh, he's now even doing the Mishnah as Persian epic poems. He then also did some Midrashic stories of the torture and death of 10 Jewish sages by Hadrian. That's like the death of Rabbi Akiva and some other rabbis. He did Hannah and her 7 sons, which is another story that until recently, until like the 70s and 80s, was still read by Persian Jews on Tisha B'Av. He did a version of the Binding of Isaac. He did a 600-verse collection of religious, moral, and practical counsels addressed to the leaders and members of the Jewish community. And he did a bunch of mystical poetry, like non-Jewish mystical poetry, translations of Rumi and other poets. So he had a huge, huge collection of writings that he did, very, very diverse, from the Tanakh all the way to Jewish rabbinical writings and non-Jewish writing. This guy was prolific. He was writing for a very, very long time. He's also a family man, and he died in his old age in Kashan. I mentioned that he was a family man because a lot of Persian Jews today, a lot of the Jews in Los Angeles and in Israel and everywhere that there are Persian Jews, have ancestry from Kashan. So I put that like very well could all be descended from this guy. So I actually want to give an example. This is one of his poems. And last week we read one of Shaheen's poems, and we're going to read a few more poems today. But this time I actually found a recording of one of these poems, and it's done in the style that Persian poems are done, which is you often have somebody reciting the poem to some background music, and then you'll have somebody singing the poem also. So we're going to listen to a little bit of that, and you can read this for yourself as we listen. You'll also notice that the last line has actually a line from the Amidah prayer that is read in Persian. So we're going to do an example. And actually, I forgot to share my sound. So I'm going to stop the screen share and reshare it with the sound.
Please remember that you can continue to, or that you can put questions or comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A.
All right, so here is a selection from a Selichot prayer. So he also wrote some liturgical works. We're going to listen to a section of this from Selichot.
مولانا عمرانی بخشا بر عجز من فقیر بنگر و از جرم من حقیر بگذر آشفته و مفلس و غریبم و از ملک حضور بی نصیبم شعری در باب سلیخوت از
So this is also my translation, so any mistakes are my own mistakes. Now we're going to go to some of the singing part.
چون آمدم به درگهت باز بردار مرا به لطف و مینداز من از کرمت امیدوارم غیر از تو کسی دیگر ندارم
خداوندا لبانم را بگشای تا دهانم مدح تو را گوید.
All right. So that is a cool little recording of Emrani's Selichot. So we don't know too much more about Emrani. That's pretty much him. But we're gonna move on to some more characters from the city of Kashan. So there's a famous rabbi, Moshe Halevi, who was born in Kashan right around the time Emrani was in his old age. And this guy became a famed rabbi and Kabbalist. He has a famous work that's in Hebrew. It's about the Jewish calendars and its customs. And he died in Kashan in 1585. And his grave is still a holy pilgrimage site there for both Jews and Muslims to this day. So hopefully we can all go visit one day. We're going to go on to yet another character from Kashan who has a lot more in his story. And if you've seen any of my lectures before, you'll know that this is one of my favorite people in Persian Jewish history. This is a very interesting character. So in 1590, Samed was born in Kashan. He was a Persian Jew from a merchant family. And he in his life became a very learned rabbi and a Sufi. So Sufism is Islamic mysticism, but remember that at this time, it wasn't just Islamic mysticism, it was generally mysticism that Jews could also be Sufis. A lot of people could be Sufis at this time. So in his life, in the 1600s, we know about a lot of forced conversions and persecutions of the Jews. They were forcibly converted into Islam a bunch of times in the 1600s. And so in much of Samed's early life, starting when he was about 23, there were a lot of forced conversions. The first time was a man from Lar, which is in the south of Iran, who converted to Islam himself, and then he went on a mission to convert everyone else. And so he came to Kashan and he did a whole kind of forced conversion. So that was the early part of Samad's life. So it's unclear whether Samad became a Shia Muslim out of forced conversion or out of genuine conviction, but at some point in his life, in addition to being a rabbi, he became a Shia cleric. So he became a leader for the Shia community, the Shia Muslim community of Kashan as well. And he started to study something called transcendent theosophy, which is a philosophical strain that is basically early existentialism. It's kind of existentialism a few hundred years before that was invented in Europe and France and everything, under somebody named Mullah Sadra, who is a Sufi Shia philosopher of existentialism. So Samad was studying with this guy. He's a pretty famous philosopher. And in 1630, at the age of 40, after he had accomplished all of this prestige as a rabbi and a cleric and an existentialist philosopher and all these things, Samad, possibly because of persecutions against the Jews, he left Kashan to travel east in search of mercantile opportunities. This is the time when a lot of people were leaving Persia. A lot of minorities were leaving. A lot of Jews were going to Baghdad to flee. And at the same time, he left, but he went east. And so he went all the way east to India. So we can see on this map where Kashan is, and we can see how far Samad went. And the story gets really interesting when Samad gets to Tata, which is in modern-day Pakistan. And in Tata, he was at a Sufi music concert, and he saw all these people singing. And one of the people singing was a young Hindu boy named Abhay Chand. And Samad, as the story goes, fell in love with Abhay Chand. So this is already getting a little bit unorthodox, you could say. It's getting quite unusual for a story about a Persian Jew from the 1600s, because Samad fell in love with a young man. And he went to the man's parents and he basically asked if this man could come with him and live with him and travel with him. And of course, the parents said no. And so Samad decided if he couldn't be with the love of his life, he didn't want any of his wealth. He didn't want anything. So he gave up all of his wealth. He even gave up his clothes, and he became famously a naked wandering dervish. And he spent pretty much the rest of his life wandering through the world naked. However, Abhay Chand did end up coming with him, and together they went all the way to Lahore, which at this time was where a lot of religious change was taking place. That's where the Sikh religion was really coming into what it is today. And together they lived in Lahore. They together translated the Torah into Persian. Abhay Chand probably became Jewish or some version of that. They both kind of were really into many religions and trying to create like a new philosophy, a new religion maybe. But in 1647, they actually contributed to the chapter about Judaism in the first book of comparative religion that we know of, which is written in India. So here's a little excerpt from that book of comparative religion. So this man is writing about Samad and Abhay Chand. He says, and the young man too met him with an equal affection, so that he could no more separate from him. And he read the book of Moses, the Psalms of David, and other books with Samad. The following verses are the composition of this young Hindu. I submit to Moses' law. I am of your religion and the guardian of your way. I am a rabbi of the Jews, an apostate, and a Muslim. So very, very unusual, strange stuff. But it also says that this author of this book writes that the learned rabbis say, according to their belief, but really according to Samad, that among the sons of Israel, it was not required that women should wear a dress. And Samad said that Isaiah, the prophet himself, used to go naked in his last days. You see this eccentric personality of Samad coming through here. Another interesting excerpt is that he actually writes that according to the Jews, God the Almighty is corporeal, and that his body is after the image of mankind and is similar to it, that during the course of time, he's dispersed in the same manner as splendor is dissipated. So I read that and I was very confused at first because I thought, that doesn't sound like Judaism at all. What is Sarmed talking about? Does he not understand Judaism? And I eventually realized that this is actually a pretty good description of Lurianic Kabbalah, which was really widespread in the Ottoman Empire at the time. And we don't have a lot of proof that it had made it to Persia yet. But this is kind of proof that Sarmed had a very good grasp on Kabbalah, because in Kabbalah, God is basically described as being infinite and yet having a human-like form. The 10 Sephirot correspond to different parts of the human body. This idea of God being dispersed like splendor is in Kabbalah. Splendor is one of the names of the Sephirot. So you read that and it does sound like this is Sarmed describing Kabbalah to an Indian author. And this is his interpretation of that. So the next stop was Delhi, Shah Jahanabad at the time, which is now Old Delhi. And in Delhi, Sarmed became kind of the personal guru of the Prince of Delhi. The prince was a guy named Dara Shikoh, who was all about creating a new religion that incorporates all of the religions. So in his court, he had Jesuit priests from Portugal. He had Zoroastrians. He had one of the early Sikh gurus. He had this Jew, Sarmed. He had Muslims. He had Hindus. He had all the religions in this court, basically trying to come up with the syncretic religious teaching and show that, the truth is one, the paths are many. And so Sarmed became quite powerful. This Persian Jew became quite powerful in the Indian Mughal Empire at the time. And Sarmed started to also write many poems. These are called rubaiyat. They are little quatrain poems. And they have some very existential and mystical themes. And some of them even have very atheistic themes. So what's cool about this is that we actually have these poems published in India, because Sarmed remains very popular in India and Pakistan to this day. So I wanted to share some of these with you. So the bottom is Farsi transliterated kind of from an Indian perspective. So some of the vowels are unusual to a Farsi speaker, but we'll read some of the English. So he writes, separation for a moment from my beloved, impossible. Unanimity in conversation, impossible. An ocean, he, meaning God, my heart, a goblet, a solecism. For the goblet to contain the ocean, impossible. Remember that these are much better in Persian. So he's basically saying, it's cool. He's saying that basically the heart cannot contain the infinite nature of God. I think that's pretty nice. Another one, his home is confined, meaning God's home, is confined not only to the temple and mosque. It doesn't really say mosque, it says the kind of holy place. The earth and the sky are equally his abode. The entire universe is in love with his story, but the wise one loves only him. And one more that gives us an idea of this kind of existential and mystical nature of Sarmed's poems. He writes, "O soul, beloved soul, how foolish you are. In the cage of the body, you dwell 1 moment, 2 or 3. If you ascend to the heaven and become the sun, you will still remain a particle not worth the counting." Now, Sarmed's story gets a little bit dark and gets a little bit strange in the end of his life. Basically, Dara Shikoh, the prince, he had a brother named Aurangzeb, who was not the forward-thinking guy that Dara Shikoh was. He was a very kind of Salafist, conservative, Sunni Muslim, and he believed that everyone had to follow the same religion as him, very different from his brother. So he took over India, and he executed his brother. He put his father under house arrest until he died. And he started killing all of the people in Dara Shikoh's court. He killed the early Sikh gurus. He killed all these interesting people who were gathered in the court. And one day he was at the steps of the Friday Mosque in Delhi, which is a place you can go and visit. I've been there. Sarmed was sitting there naked on the steps of this mosque. And Aurangzeb came, and he obviously didn't like this guy sitting naked there. And he said, "What are you doing? Being naked is a sin." And Sarmed said, "Okay, if it's a sin, pass me that blanket over there." And so the servants picked up the blanket, and underneath the blanket, there was a vision of all of the people that Aurangzeb had executed. It was all of their severed heads. This is kind of gets legendary at this point, but Sarmed had these magic powers. And so Aurangzeb saw those heads, and the idea was like, you calling my nakedness is sin, you killed all these people, that's a sin. Obviously, the prince did not like that, and so he put Saimad on trial. And this is a common thing when you're on trial in a place like this. You would have to say the shahada, which is the line that says, that turns you into a Muslim, basically. It proves you're a Muslim. So it's a line that says, there is no God but Allah. This is a line that was used at the same time throughout Persia to convert Jews to Islam as well. So Saimad was on trial and they said, say the line, there is no God but Allah. And Saimad, being an eccentric guy, said, there is no God. And that's all he said. So was he kind of trolling the prince? Was this really his philosophy? It's unclear. But of course, the prince didn't like that. And so he chopped off Saimad's head, as you can see in the picture on the left. However, the legend goes that Saimad did not die. He picked up his head and he walked away, or he walked up to confront the prince. But then he decided to go into the grave, and he himself went into the grave. And this grave is still a holy site. It's still there on the steps of the Friday Mosque in Delhi. I've been to this grave. There are always, to this day, still Sufi Muslims who are there praying at the grave of this Persian Jew. They don't necessarily even know that he was a Persian Jew, but he is very important. In fact, he's so important to Sufis that if you type in his name on the internet, like on YouTube, you'll see videos come up of his poems translated and recited in Punjabi. And so here's an example of that I just wanted to share for a few seconds.
हर वक्त ही इस जहान अंदर अखां गिल्लियां कीतियां रोया हां मैं सदा खारे समुंदर खजालतां दे गर्क वांग शर्मिंदियां होया हां मैं.
So that's just pretty wild to me that you can find a Persian Jew's poems from Persian translated into Punjabi on the internet. Pretty cool. So at the same time, all of these persecutions were happening in Persia. And so I want to just mention some of the characters we know about who resisted this forced conversion era. So as I mentioned, there was this guy in Lar, this oppressor who basically came north and started oppressing Jews throughout the country. And we have records of Jews who fought back against this man, someone who punched his teeth out during a brawl in the synagogue, another guy who eventually drowned this guy in the Caspian Sea. He tricked him into getting on a boat and drowned him and saved the Jews for the time being. There are a bunch of different examples of these people. And there's also Jews who, instead of fleeing and going to Baghdad, stayed in Kashan and actually wrote epic poems about what happened. Kind of just like these epic poems of Shaheen and Emrani that we mentioned, they wrote epic poems about these oppressions that were happening in the 1600s. And it's very important for us today that that's actually how we know a lot about our heritage. The edicts of forced conversion were finally lifted in 1662 due to the intervention of various rabbis, as well as a bunch of Muslim mullahs who had been friends of Saimad Kashani. So in the end, the Persian Jews were actually saved in part because of Saimad Kashani, even though he was kind of this apostate character, even though he was a naked Sufi, Jewish, Muslim, homosexual dervish that was wandering the world. Even because of that, he saved, in a way, contributed to the saving of the Persian Jews. Now, after the forced conversion era, we have a lot of characters who, rabbis mainly, who come up and they're trying to preserve what we had lost. A lot of books had been destroyed. A lot of the poems that I mentioned had been burned or thrown into rivers. Torahs had all been thrown into rivers. The synagogues had all been destroyed. So you see a lot of rabbis come up and try to write down what had been lost. So one character is Khaja David ben Benyamin HaKohen. And we don't really, what we know about him is from manuscripts that haven't been published. A lot of them are just things that I've found and I've read and I've translated, and this is how we know about him. So he was a rabbi from Khansar. Khansar is a small town not far from Esfahan. This man had a mastery of different layers of Hebrew language and literature. You can really tell if you read him that he really knew what he was doing. He was a very, very smart man. And in 1674, so only about 12 years after the persecutions ended, he recorded parts of the original Persian liturgy, which is different than the current Sephardic liturgy that we use. He recorded popular Persian, Kurdish, Turkish, and Yemenite piyutim, which are Hebrew liturgical poems. He wrote a polemic against Shabbatai Tzvi, which is really interesting. He uses all these rabbinical proofs to prove that Shabbatai Tzvi couldn't have been the Messiah, which is very interesting. He interacted with rabbis from all over. There's a story that is a little bit more personal about his life, where he came to Kashan to marry the daughter of someone named Yehuda. And while there, he went on another trip, leaving his possessions and his manuscripts behind. And when he came back from his trip, he found that the manuscripts had all been stolen from him, and the woman that he was supposed to marry was also, I guess, unavailable. Not sure what it means, but we only get his side of the story. Not sure what her side or Yehuda's side was, don't know, but it's really interesting when you read a manuscript and you get a little bit of these people's personal lives in there too. So who was Yehuda? We're not sure. One person, there is someone named Yehuda from Kashan that we know about from this era. So I'm not saying this is necessarily him, but we're going to talk about Yehuda ben Elazar, who's another rabbi from the same era. And Yehuda ben Elazar is known for being the rationalist philosopher rabbi. So kind of like Maimonides. Maimonides is known for being the rationalist philosopher. He's all about using logic to prove that Judaism is true, basically. Yehuda ben Elazar was very similar. He is a rabbi. He was a doctor also, just like Maimonides, and he was this rationalist philosopher. He gathered knowledge from many, many sources, both from Persian rabbis, from Maimonides, from North African rabbis, from Spanish and Italian rabbis. He had books from all of these. He also had sources like Plato and Aristotle, who he actually criticizes a little bit, and a bunch of Islamic philosophers. So this guy was very well read. He had a huge library, and he incorporates quotes from all of these different people in his books. The main book we know of by him is from 1686, and it's a book of Jewish law and philosophy. It incorporates all of those sources along with the Bible, the Talmud, the Midrash, Zohar, which is Kabbalah, the New Testament, which is Christian, the Apocrypha, and the Quran. So this guy really, really well read. His writing is very sophisticated. I've read some of it, and it's quite hard to understand. Not because it's poorly written or anything. It's hard to understand because the concepts are so complicated. He criticizes his own hero, Maimonides. He criticizes Rashi, even though he holds these people in high regard. He's just so smart himself that he's able to like pick at what they say. And a very interesting part in his book is that he rails against what he calls those who don't understand the basic issues of the Torah, but instead consider themselves Kabbalists. So people who do the mystical stuff without even understanding the basics of Judaism. So here's a quote by him that I enjoy. He says, "In my opinion, who is a heretic? He who has no knowledge of the rational world and the literal meaning of the Torah, and occupies himself with the Sephirot in his wish to be considered a divine mystic. Concerning him, the sages said, he lacks the outside keys, but searches for the inner ones. We might call him, and certain Ashkenazim with their convoluted treatises, a pious fool, or Hasid Shuteh." I just love that quote. It's really interesting to hear rabbis take shots at each other. And this is a nice one because it kind of places Yehuda ben Elazar in the greater Jewish world, and we see what attitudes about people were at the time. So Yehuda ben Elazar wrote some other stuff. He wrote a short document on the dangers of wine, again, just giving us an idea of who he was. Several other known works. He remained influential among Persia's rabbis for a long time. And yet today, his masterpiece is only translated into Hebrew, not yet into English. It was translated into Hebrew by Amnon Netzer, like in the last 50 years or so. And today, this rabbi is virtually unknown outside of academic circles. I know a few people know about him, but generally I've only heard academics talk about him. I've never heard him quoted by any rabbi during a speech in the synagogue, definitely not Persian rabbis. So that's a shame, I think. I think there's a lot of good stuff in his writings, and hopefully they'll be made available to the greater world at some point. Now, I know we're tired of Kashan, so much Kashan. There's one more character from Kashan that we're going to talk about. And this is another poet. His name's Aminah. His real name is Benjamin ben Mishael, and he was maybe a student of Yehuda ben Elazar, but he became a poet himself. He's kind of the third in the trifecta of great Judeo-Persian poets. There are many others, but this is kind of the third in the line after Shahin and Emrani. So in 1700, at the age of 28, Amina started writing his own epic versifications of the parts of the Tanakh that weren't yet completed by the other poets. He did some editing of other books. He wrote his own version of the Binding of Isaac. He wrote some piyutim. He did a translation of the Book of Esther. And his life changed in 1722 when he was about 50 years old. The Afghans invaded Persia at this time. The Safavid Empire came to an end. The Afghans took over, and the Jews were in favor of this because the Shia Muslims had not been very nice to the Jews, and the Sunnis came in, so the Jews were in favor of the Sunni invasion. Of course, the Sunnis also massacred the Jews, but despite that, Amina wrote a poem praising the Afghan ruler, which is really interesting to see. And at the age of 53, Amina divorced his wife. So that's another change in his writing that we see. So a quote from Amina's wife to Amina that we see in his poems is, "I do not love you. I'll never smile at you again. And if I remain alive, I will drive you to your death." I just love this. I love seeing the personal life of these poets come through their writing. So he left his wife and his 7 children, moved to the mountains near Hamadan, as you can see on the map, far away from all the wars and fighting. And at this time, there were a lot of forced conversions of the Jews again, as the Shia very quickly took over the country again. And here he did more translations. He wrote the translations into Persian of the Azharot poems of Solomon ibn Gabriel, who is a Spanish writer, poet from the medieval age. And we don't know when Amina died. He died at a late age probably, but we see from his poems that after his divorce, they become a lot darker, they become a lot sadder. He has a poem called On Becoming Bitter Towards Women. So very interesting poet. He's a very interesting poet to read, and we have a lot of his poems. I didn't include any here, but we have a lot of his poems in manuscript form. A lot of them have been translated into English as well. Now, we're going to move away from Kashan. We're going to go to the city of Yazd, which is a small city in the desert of central Iran. And Yazd became a very important Jewish city in the 1700s because during all the forced conversions, the Muslim community of Yazd actually protected the Jews and didn't let them be forcibly converted. So in the 1700s, we see the rise of Yazd as a Jewish center. And we have 2 major rabbinical figures at the time. There's Mullah Or Sharga, who is a very famous rabbi. And there is one of his students, Simon Tov Melamed. We're going to talk about them. So Or Sharga he was born in 1708 or around 1708 to a famous rabbinical line of that city. His name comes from the Aramaic word for light of a candle, or like in Hebrew, or is light. And Sharga it comes from the Aramaic shraga, which means candle. Now, those words are both related to Persian words. So light of a candle in Persian would be nur cheragha. So nur cheragh is like Or Sharga. That's where those words come from. And at the age of 12, Or Sharga was so learned that he actually surpassed his own father, Mullah Shemuel, and he was appointed as the leader of the Jewish community of Yazd at the age of 12. He soon began doing public lectures and establishing Jewish schools, both in Yazd, and he would send his students to other cities to establish Jewish schools there. So he did a lot for the general Persian Jewish community. There are a lot of stories about him. He was a Kabbalist who stayed up all night studying the Torah. There are miracles associated with him. Apparently, he learned his Kabbalah from Eliyahu Hanavi himself, who had come to him in visions in the middle of the night. There are references from him by the Baal Shem Tov. So like as far away as the Ukraine, there are references to this rabbi. There are stories about the governor of the city seeing a pillar of fire over his house and then going to him for help in defeating the rebels of the city. There are a lot of interesting stories associated with this man. And in 1793, he died and he left behind many descendants who continued as rabbis to this day. So a lot of his descendants are rabbis in Jerusalem. They went there and established what's called the Yazdi synagogue in Jerusalem, or the Or Sharga synagogue. It's a very, very prestigious place. In fact, it has so much prestige, this community and this rabbi has so much prestige that the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel and his father, the previous Sephardic chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, they do their weekly Torah study shiurim at this synagogue to this day. I think they're on Wednesdays. So that's a pretty interesting thing. And in Yazd itself, in Iran, the tomb of these rabbis is still so famous and so venerated that it's still a holy annual pilgrimage site. Jewish people from all over Iran, the few that are left, still go there every year. It's said to be a good place to meet your future spouse. And hopefully we can all go visit this beautiful tomb someday also. Now, one of his greatest students was Siman Tov Melamed, also of Yazd. When he was sending out his students to different cities to start schools, Siman Tov Melamed was the one sent to Mashhad. Mashhad was a city that had only recently gotten a Jewish community. It's a holy Shia city, and so up until these recent times, Jews were not allowed to live in that city at all. And so recently there was a burgeoning community there, and Siman Tov Melamed was sent to be their leader. He was an amazing poet. He's a philosopher. He wrote in Persian, Hebrew, and Aramaic, very, very learned. And he was very, very mystical. And what kind of sets this rabbi apart is that he was very explicitly a Sufi. He was also never became Muslim. He was always Jewish, but he's very explicitly Sufi. So kind of like how Yehuda ben Elazar was the rationalist philosopher of the Persian rabbis, Siman Tov Melamed is like the explicitly Sufi rabbi of the Persian Jews. He wrote a lot of stuff. His masterpiece is called Hayat ol-Ruh, and it's a massive mystical and philosophical treatise that turns Maimonides' 13 principles of faith into a Persian epic poem, basically. And so Emrani did that a few hundred years before, but this is a new version of that. And it's very explicitly uses Sufi language, which is really interesting. So a contemporary reader might read this and be surprised to read the word Taliban, referring to Jewish people. Taliban, of course, today is the Taliban, right? A group that we don't really associate with the Jews. At the time, the word Taliban, it means students, and it's a word that he uses to signify Jewish people who are searching for God, searchers. There are words like Qawwal that he uses, which is today known as Qawwali, which is a genre of music of like Sufi religious Muslim music. If you haven't heard Qawwali music, highly recommend you listen to it. You can get an idea of what the music of this era's Persian Jews might have sounded like. You see a lot of these terms, and if you didn't know better, you might think that this is a Muslim author, except that there's Hebrew all over it and all kinds of rabbinical concepts, and it's all based on Maimonides. So I have a couple examples. I'm actually going to skip this one, even though it has some interesting stuff. The second to last line is a cool one. He says, "Everywhere I look, there is no breath without it," being God. It is nowhere, but its effects and light are everywhere, which is a really kind of mystical idea. It's very cool. However, we're going to look at this one a little more. So this is another poem from Hayat ol-Ruh. All of Hayat ol-Ruh, it's very, very long. It's all, it was published in a printed version, still in Judeo-Persian. I don't think it's been translated into English. So this is my translation that I just did. And it says, "No precedent takes precedence over it," being God. "It has no accomplice, nor comrade, nor colleague. It is itself existence. It is the master. It is the living. The existence of its essence is hidden even from itself. It is knowledge. It is understanding. It is goodness. In all goodness, it is the creator, not the created. It is, it will be, it was." So I want to point that out. So it is, it will be, it was is a translation into Persian of Vahu Haya, Vahu Hove, Vahu Yihya, which is familiar to a lot of us from Adon Olam, and it's one of Maimonides' 13 principles. It means that God is, God always was, God always will be. It has not been diminished, and it will not be added to. It is the judge, the opener, and the witness. It is one without peer. It is unity. It is light. It is out of sight, but hidden in the heart, there are allusions to it. It is without pair, without partner, without companion. It is worthy by itself. It is existence, and it is the extractor to existence. So that's a really interesting concept that, there is the creator and creation, but that God is both the creator and creation. The passion for its worship burns from the soul and heart. The earth and heavens and other people of the world have come into existence and wholeness from its existence. So anyway, it continues, it goes on and on. But it's a really, really deep poem. And every time I look at any section of it and read it, it's like this guy was so philosophical. This guy living in Mashhad in the 1700s. Really beautiful, and I really, really hope that this poem can become available for wider audiences to read. So very much like Abraham ben Maimonides, who was the son of Maimonides, who was a writer in the 1100s, and he was also a Sufi Jew. Siman Tov Melamed also wrote about how the Sufism he was practicing was actually originally Jewish before it became Muslim. So that's kind of how they justify this. They say that just because we're Sufis doesn't mean we're Muslim, we are still Jewish. This is actually originally a Jewish practice. And he was careful to remain explicitly Jewish despite his Sufi ways. And in fact, he had to participate in forced disputations, meaning arguments against Shias and apostate Jews throughout his life in Mashhad. So he was always trying to keep the Jews Jewish. And he died probably in the 1820s, only a decade or so before the Al-Ahdad, which is the forced conversion of the Mashhadi Jewish community to Islam, which is well known, happened in 1839, and they basically remained secret Jews until the modern era. Now, we're going to go on to one more character. I think we have time for one more. And this is Molla Yaqub ben Paltiel. I include him because he lived in the 1800s and he was a rabbi. And a lot of the rhetoric you hear around Persian Jews is that in the modern era, the Jews of Persia lost all their knowledge. They didn't know anything about the Torah, about Hebrew, about anything, and they kind of like became nobodies. Yaqub ben Paltiel is a rabbi who's not very well known. I know about him because I found manuscripts that he wrote and have read through them and got an idea about who he was. So in the 1800s, he was a rabbi from a rabbinical lineage. He was probably born around 1840. And he became the rabbi of Rasht, which is a city in the north in the Caspian region. And at this time, it had a mixed population of Jews from Kashan, Esfahan, and Gilan, which is where Rasht is. It was a mercantile city. A lot of people came to do trade there. And here, Yaqub became a great poet. And he also sometimes wrote in Judeo-Persian. Mainly, he wrote in Hebrew. In 1860, he wrote Judeo-Persian commentaries on Pirkei Avot, so clearly he knew the Mishnah, he knew what he was talking about. He was a rabbi, he was knowledgeable. In 1882, he compiled a book of Hebrew piyutim by Persian Jews. So Persian Jews who had been writing in Hebrew for many, many years. He included many of his own original poems, all while the Jews were being persecuted throughout Persia. He has a piyut in honor of the land of Israel. He has one for the occasion of his own marriage. He refers to his wife often with the phrase, Ani la dodi v'dodi li, which I think is really beautiful. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. And we actually know a little bit about his wife. Her name was Maryam, daughter of Abraham, and she herself was literate and learned. So I love reading about Jewish women who were literate, learned, and they were actually important people in our history as well. And the two of them wrote at least one piyut together. It's very possible that they actually wrote many of the piyutim together. And its content is quite romantic and mystically religious. Like you can read it as being the love between Yaqub and Maryam, or you can read it as being the love between the people of Israel and God. A lot of poetry has, like religious Jewish poetry and Persian poetry has that double meaning. So here is actually from the manuscript. It says, Siman Yaqub ben Paltiel, Betziruf Maryam bat Abraham Zugato. So that means it's written by Yaqub ben Paltiel in combination with his wife, Maryam bat Abraham. And this poem is called Yadidi Nafshi Yadidi, which means my beloved, my soul, my beloved. And these are just 3 stanzas of it. It's a 32 stanza poem. It goes on. And it's really, really nice. It's really beautiful. I can really see this being put to a tune and sang around the Shabbat table or something like that. And it goes, Yadidi dod Yadidi, Elyon kabel bekashti, Melech rofeh verafeh makati, Yadidi nafshi Yadidi. And it goes on and on, 32 stanzas. Really beautiful stuff. And it's written in the 1800s. The Jews were still writing. The Jews were doing a lot. The fact is just that we don't know about what they were writing because none of it's been published. It's all in manuscript form. So hopefully that can be changed. Now, Yaqub he would go between Tehran and Resht. This is a picture of the Jewish neighborhood of Tehran in this era. In 1887, he wrote a compilation of Judeo-Persian stories and philosophies. Some of his sermons, commentaries, and rabbinical works have been preserved in manuscripts. This was very cool because I actually know some people who are descended from this rabbi. A friend of mine is his great-great-great-grandson. And I actually sat down with this friend and taught him how to read Judeo-Persian, and we sat there and read the Tisha B'Av sermon of my friend's great-great-great-grandfather, which is in Farsi, and it's really easy to understand, and it's really cool. It's really cool that his sermons survived. Many of his descendants became famous Baha'is. Some of his descendants converted to the Baha'i religion, which was very common at that time among Persian Jews. But also many of the Persian Jews of the community here in Los Angeles are descended from this man. So in the 18 and 1900s, we have many, many more notable Persian Jews. We have doctors, musicians, rabbis, leaders. Not enough time to really get into them, but there are people like Mullah Murad Aghalar of Mashhad, who is a translator, teacher, rabbi who did it all while pretending to be a Muslim. So he lived this double life, very interesting character. There's Haim Moreh, picture on the top left. He was the blind rabbi and educator of Tehran. There are Talmudists. There was Suleiman Haim, the bottom right picture, who was a writer, linguist. He wrote the dictionary of Persian to English that is still used today. There's the Shofet family, which is a family of rabbis, and there's the Nedavud family, who are Jewish musicians who actually helped preserve Persian classical music for the world. So we have many, many more famous characters. Some of them in the 18 and 1900s are more well-known, which is why we won't get into them too much. And yeah, so that's kind of a quick overview of some of the characters of Persian Judaism from the Safavid era till the modern day. A lot of really, really interesting people, mystics, really cool writings. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. This is just kind of what we know from a few sources and from reading some of their works. There's a lot more to find out about them. And I hope to do that in my lifetime. And I hope to keep telling people about these characters so we can keep learning about them. So thanks for coming. And I guess we'll do questions now.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate your sharing that with us. And I think it's so important. So many people talk about how Persian Jewry kind of lost their scholarship. And so I really appreciate that you're bringing it back. Just an easy question to start with. Please do throw your questions into the Q&A or into the chat. I will look at both. But a basic question, where did you get the Slichot recording from, if you don't mind sharing that?
Sure. Yeah. So the Slichot recording, I actually, a friend of mine found it during this last September in the Slichot season. There are a lot of these. It's on YouTube, basically, and it's recorded by Nasser Zar, who's a singer, and he, I guess it was actually on a CD that came out in the 90s, and I don't know where to get that CD, but the recording is on YouTube. It's like an hour long. It has a bunch of different Slichot by different authors. There's one actually by Siman Tov Melamed in there. So it's very cool. It's the first time that I was able to find a recording of some of these people. So that was very cool. And if you want, I can send you that link, Drora, and if you want, you can send it to.
Yeah, I can definitely send it in the follow-up email. So thank you. Quick question that I had, and again, please do throw your questions into the chat or Q&A. You translated, and I don't know the original word in Persian, and I don't speak Persian, but you translated God as it. Is that a respectful thing in the Persian language, or?
No, so the Persian language is gender neutral. There is no he or she in the language. And so that's just one thing whenever you're translating Hebrew into.
There's no gender at all?
Correct, yeah. So the word for the third person is always, it's the same word for it that you would use for he or she. But in that poem itself, so it actually uses the word chodesh. So that everything says chodesh regarding God, which chodesh means like itself or himself or herself, but it means itself. And actually it's cool because it's related to the word etymologically related to the word choda, which means God. So like God and self are kind of like related words. But yeah, while I was translating it, I was like, I'm not sure if I should make this himself or itself, but because that poem is so mystical and it has this whole idea of like, it says a lot of things about like God sort of visibly not existing. Like it says like our experience of God is God not existing, and yet God's existence being obvious to us at all times. And so it never really anthropomorphizes God in the poem. It has God as this like, infinite thing, stuff, that is all around us. So I decided to translate it that way.
Interesting. And so, Shore backs you up on that it is common and not disrespectful.
Yeah,
so you
translating Persian into English is strange because you actually don't know if it's saying he or she. So it's like,
so you would use the same pronoun for a table that you would for a person.
Yeah, it is the same pronoun. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I'll go to somebody else's question, even though I had more. What was the audience for the Jewish Persian poetry? Mostly the local Persian community, or did it have a literary impact on the non-Jewish circles in Iran as well?
Very good question. Very likely these poems were performed. They weren't like read so much. I mean, people were literate, but from the copies, it's clear like these were used by somebody. People would memorize them, people would sing them at campfires, people would perform them. And from the content of the poems, it actually is clear that they weren't just for Jews. So for example, Shaheen has a lot of stories in there from Islamic stuff. It has a lot of references and praises of the current leader, like the current ruler, whoever it is. So Shaheen has praises of the Mongol rulers of the time. Emrani has praises of the like Turkic rulers and later the Safavid rulers, even though they didn't like each other. It has like, it's very suggested when you read them that these were generally performed, usually for Jews, but often for non-Jews as well. Like they were, Jews were kind of a minstrel class and were always hired throughout history to do, they would perform at weddings, they would perform at functions. They were the musicians, especially in the Safavid era when performing music was banned for Muslims. So the Jews were the ones who preserved music through all these years. So very likely it was not just for Jews.
And I'm going to read the question, but I think I'm going to tweak it a little. Who are some current rabbinical leaders in Iran today was the question, but I think it should be more of Iran today, of Iranian heritage, unless you know some in Iran today.
There are rabbis in Iran. I don't really know them. There's one who came and visited LA not that long ago, who's like the current kind of rabbi in Iran. Like he leads the community. I don't really know too much about him. Of the Iranian community, there are many rabbis here in LA and in Israel and in New York. So Shofet is a famous one from the Shofet family. He's kind of people call him like the chief rabbi. And he's the rabbi at Nesach, which is the very, very big Persian synagogue in LA, but there are many others. There are ones who trace back to the city of Khansar and are probably descended from Khaja David, who we talked about from Khansar. There are rabbis from Yazd and Kerman who we still know about. So yeah, there are many rabbis throughout LA. Most of them, however, when I've listened to their speeches, if they quote a rabbi, they're usually quoting Ashkenazi rabbis, maybe the Rambam, I've really never heard anyone quote a rabbi from Persian Jewry, which is a shame, but also understandable when these books aren't widespread and published.
I think it's also, unfortunately, an inferiority complex. Sometimes there was just a write-up about it in an Israeli newspaper talking about how if you're going to fight amongst yourselves, also fight amongst the Ashkenazim, because you can call them out on things too. Do you have time for a few more questions?
I have time, yeah.
Okay, so if everybody's okay, whoever can stay, otherwise I will send you the recording. Let's give it another few minutes because there are so many good questions here. The first one also is just a basic question. I don't know if you know, what do you know about the size of the Jewish community in Iran through the periods you covered?
We don't have very good numbers, but there are there are numbers that say at some point, probably right before the time we covered, but at some point Persia was 1/3 Jewish. So at some point, very, very Jewish. Then throughout the eras, I mean, it fluctuated a lot there. We have a pretty good idea of how many there were in the 1600s, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's a very large community. Basically every town in Persia at some point had Jews, from the smallest villages to the biggest cities had Jews. I have ancestors from a town that is so small, you would never expect there to have been Jews there, but there were. Basically to the point that anyone with Persian heritage probably has Jewish heritage to some degree, because so many people were forcibly converted to Islam or converted at different points. And, that's just, people are all descended from
All mixed.
Yeah. So it really has, there have been very large numbers in the past. Today, very few, only a few thousand.
Right, almost left, like your family. How does present day Iranian rabbinic leadership, oh, you answered that already, sorry. Also, what are some recommended resources for us to read more about the figures you discussed? And before you answer that, I'm going to answer, or some of the main resources you used. I do want to mention that we do have a course, a pre-recorded course online. I told you about that before, Alan, on the Persian experience, which actually has 2 full lessons on, why am I blanking on their names now? The poets you started with today?
Yeah, Shaheen and Imrani. Yeah.
There you go.
He mentions a lot of the people that we talked about also.
Right. So I just want to put it out there, and I'll send you the link for that, but you can answer in addition to that, Alan.
Yeah, well, let me answer the other one. I actually haven't answered that other one. So how the present day Iranian rabbinic leadership view the rabbis who are also Sufi followers. Generally, I haven't really heard them talk about it, but from what I've heard about, they don't really like to bring up some of those people. So, for example, Shaheen is a lot of the current rabbis today don't like talking about Shaheen because they think that he was it doesn't fit with their kind of Orthodox mode that they've learned here in America or in Israel. So they like to minimize Shaheen and say that he wasn't so great. I disagree with them. But that's kind of one of the, they wouldn't be the ones really bringing up these Sufi guys. Maybe Simon Tov Melamed, because he was so kind of deeply into rabbinical Judaism, and he had this deep knowledge that I think a rabbinical Jew today might read and be on board with. But I'm really not sure. And then the resources. So the resources that are available, I mean, a lot of it is just kind of online encyclopedias, things like that. A few articles here and there, but really to get deeper, I look at primary sources. I find the manuscripts and actually read the manuscripts, which takes a long time for me. I had to really improve my Farsi reading and my ability to read Farsi and Hebrew letters and the vocabulary and the dialects of the time and everything. So that's the problem, is that most people, even if they speak one of these languages, aren't going to put in the time to get familiar and comfortable with the dialects and with the style and the poetry and all of that. And that's why I want to make these more available and translate more of it and get more of it out there.
And we have to do some crowdsourcing to get you the funds to actually make them available in English. That would be great.
Currently seeking funds, as always.
Yeah, no, that's a big one. So it's just spreading the word about that out there. And then I think this is a good question to end on. To what level is this history and culture known in today's American Jewish Persian communities? And is this knowledge in decline, or are more people becoming aware?
As far as I know, it's not particularly known in American Jewish Persian communities. I've only found a few people who know about any of these people. If you mention Shaheen, the older generation knows about him and has maybe read a little bit. But the younger generations certainly don't. So I'm always telling people about who's where is your family from? They'll say the name of the city, and I'll say oh, here's a cool person who was from that city. Most people don't know about it. And I guess just as time goes on, the older generation gets older, forgets, they don't really know, that knowledge gets closer and closer to being lost. However, there are some things moving in the right direction. For example, the National Library of Israel has finally digitized most of their catalog. And so they have this huge trove of Judeo-Persian manuscripts that nobody's ever sat down and decoded, but they have now just put them online. And so from the comfort of my home, I can sit there and like find these and start translating them or reading them and seeing what's even in there. So things moving in the right direction, hopefully. And really what I want to do is to do this kind of lecture, but for young Persian Jews, people of my generation who are starting to have kids who at this point don't know enough to pass on to their kids. And hopefully I want to make this more a part of our culture, make this something we're proud of, these characters, these people, these traditions. Because I think they really enrich who we are today. And I think that would be a nice move in the right direction.
And I want to add to that I don't even think it should only be the Persian younger generation. I think it should be across the board. This is our heritage. It's all part of the Jewish mosaic. So we wish you much success, and we really want to continue supporting this. So hopefully we will expand, and let's start a crowdsourcing somehow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have
Thanks
a
for
wonderful rest of your day, everybody.